In this presentation, we'll discuss about the Italian Settecento, so the 1700s, the 18th century, from three different perspectives. So the perspective of politics and philosophy, so kind of a European perspective. From the perspective of urban development, we will discuss the influence of three cities in particular in Italy, so Milan, Naples, and Venice. And we'll consider also the 17th century as really the Italian century, not because of any particular domination that Italy exerts on the rest of Europe, but because of the spreading of the Italian language through opera and through Italian thought. Now, a little bit of history. When we deal with the 17th century, we have to keep into account two key dates, especially in Europe. One is 1713, and the other one is, of course, 1789. We'll discuss about it later. So 1713 is the date of the Peace of Utrecht after the Spanish Succession Wars. So basically, after being dominated by Spain, Milan and Naples actually pass to the Austrian side of the Habsburg family, which was a family both German and Spanish. So this is the century where Italy acquires a different political dimension. Now, in the century, I want to point out, after 1713, three key figures in this new political reconfiguration of Italy, of like enlightened reformists. One is in Naples. So Naples will actually return to Spanish rule after a brief Austrian parenthesis in 1734. And it will be ruled by Charles of Bourbon, who will then become in 1759 the Emperor of Spain, so Charles III of Spain. And he will inaugurate a series of reforms in the city that will place Naples in the global map of Europe. The other figure is the figure of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, who will be the first woman to rule over the Habsburg Empire and will also rule over Milan. So Milan and Vienna will be in a tight relationship during the mid-century. And the third figure that I want to point your attention to is actually the figure of the son of Maria Theresa, who also the brother of Marie Antoinette, who will be killed later in the French Revolution. So Leopold, who will then become Emperor Leopold II at the death of Joseph II in 1790 in Austria. So basically, Austria has influence over Tuscany, or the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. And so this will inaugurate a season of reforms that will make the Florentine Settecento thrive. Now, the other date, as I mentioned, we will discuss briefly later about 1776 and the American Revolution, but the key other date for European events is 1789, so the beginning of the French Revolution, and this is how Italy looks like in 1789. Now, Italy undergoes all the series of events that will lead from the French Revolution to the Age of Terror to the establishment of Napoleon's rule. Napoleon will invade Italy, especially northern Italy, and found like a so-called Cisalpine Republic. So an affiliated French Republic in Italy. This will be the flag of the Cisalpine Republic. Another flag will be the tricolor flag, based on the model of the tricolor French flag, with the green instead of the blue. So the Italian flag actually is the flag of the Cisalpine Republic, so affiliated with the French flag during this time. Napoleon will then declare himself King of Italy in 1805, and his rule over Europe will be extended, and this is his peak in 1812, to most of kind of central Italy, even Rome, and the Kingdom of Italy will be in the northern Italy will be affiliated with the French Empire. This before the end of Napoleon that we'll discuss in following episodes. Now, three words are most commonly used to define this century, and we'll observe them now. So, Enlightenment, Neoclassicism, or Pre-Romanticism. Now, Enlightenment is a philosophy that focuses its attention on the role of reason as the measure of everything, and reason as the kind of the emphasis on reason as the reaction against kind of the Baroque emphasis on marvel and passion and the grotesque and the eccentric. So actually the Enlightenment portrays this image of the previous century, creates this image of the Baroque as an eccentric or negative or decadent century, as a way to present itself as the century of lights. There are different forms of enlightenment, philosophical, political, or cultural. I want to point your attention to three moments that are particularly revealing of three different ways of interpreting enlightenment. One is like the figure of Maria Theresa of Austria that we discussed. So an approach to absolutism or government that is related to the establishment of reforms. So enlightenment connected to the reforms of certain systems. Then you will see in the second image from the right the Encyclopédie by Diderot and D'Alembert. So in the in the 1750s, two French philosophers actually compile an encyclopedia of all human knowledge, where all the entries are meant to classify and order all human knowledge. The Encyclopédie is the first attempt to create kind of a universal knowledge, yet at the same time it's also the first time in which knowledge is standardized, so kind of reduced to a standard, so the entries. This is what posterior philosophers, Adorno and Horkheimer, will call the dialectics of enlightenment. So a universal reach, all men are created equal, we would say, but this universal reach has the limit of the standardization of knowledge. This may be a reflection also on the internet, on what the internet is today. Now, we see also in another image two well-known American founding fathers, so Jefferson and Franklin. Jefferson is the quintessential reformist soul of the Enlightenment. So the writer of the Constitution and the hand behind the Declaration of the Independence. So the philosopher that structures these ideas of égalité, fraternité, liberté, so the ideas of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, he forms them in a political form, so which gives the political assets of the United States. Now, the United States is the first experiment of a reformist nation, of a democratic nation, of this we the people that breaks apart the logic of absolutism or also enlightened monarchies. Now, the most famous figure in Europe of the American founding fathers is actually Ben Franklin, and not only for his scientific research, especially on electricity, but most importantly because he was a diplomat and he worked in Paris and London, and his ideas were very wide known. He was so much well known and cherished in Europe that actually one city in Calabria is named Philadelphia after his own city of Philadelphia in the United States. So the city of Philadelphia which you will find on the map in Calabria, was established in 1783 after an earthquake, and was replanned around the same plan of the city of Philadelphia. So this is the American city of Philadelphia, the original plan, and this is a picture of, as you can see, the same image of the Calabrian Philadelphia. This was kind of like a tribute to Franklin that allows you to understand how much his fame was spread throughout Europe. Now, Enlightenment is also the movement that is behind the French Revolution. So here's like Marie Antoinette, the daughter of Maria Theresa and the sister of Leopold, with her husband Louis XVI. They were both beheaded in 1793 in the course of the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, 1791, give political form to the ideals of the Enlightenment and give certain political representation to it, but it degenerates pretty quickly in the so-called Age of Terror. So from 1794-96, especially revolving around the figure of Robespierre. So lots of execution and lots of attempts to really establish a hyper rational kind of state. And after this experience, in 1796, a general from Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte, actually manages to take hold of power and expand the revolution, bring it outside the borders of France. Other European nations were trying to contain the spreading of the revolutionary ideals, but really Napoleon is the one that expands the French dominion throughout Europe. So in this sense, we talk about neoclassicism as an art that wants to support the new republic, but also to support the new empire that Napoleon will later create. He will declare himself the emperor of France. So the French Revolution starts against the monarchy, against absolutism, and ends with the proclamation of Napoleon in general as an emperor. And so neoclassicism, in a way, retrieves some of the classical forms. So, for example, like the Arc, and this is the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and reinvents them in a new key, so a new classicism. We see that classicism is actually the style that befits an imperial kind of government. So this is also a neoclassical statue by Canova, the Italian sculptor Canova, depicting Napoleon as Mars, the peacekeeper. So the art, the neoclassical art, is an art that aims at glorifying the emperor. Actually, neoclassicism has three phases in Europe, and the first phase is actually related to the city of Rome, which under Pius VI undergoes like a phase of great expansion. Especially this phase owes much to the rediscovery of the ruins of Pompeii and the theories of Winkelmann about an ideal beauty that is drawn from the classical model. So art should pursue harmony and regular forms as opposed to the eccentric, elaborated forms of the Baroque art. The second and third phase are related to the celebration of the Republic and also the imperial power of Napoleon. So Arc de Triomphe and the statue of Napoleon as Mars the peacekeeper. The third word that we'll use to describe the culture of the 1700s is actually the word pre-romanticism, that describes kind of the second half of the century. So the idea of like rediscovering feeling in an anti-materialist key, so a reaction against the materialism, the atheism, the rationalism of the Enlightenment, and the rediscovery of a sense of sublime, or something that is not under our control. So also the emphasis on feelings, feelings that are evocative, like melancholy, and the rediscovery of ages that are not completely well known, so like the Gothic, the Middle Ages, and in connection especially to the cult of the lugubrious, of death, something that escapes our control. Now, pre-Romanticism is a broad term that applies to several European cultures. In the British English context, it really starts with the poetry of Thomas Gray, and especially with the elegy in a country churchyard, so the cemeterial poetry that is connected to this creation by James Macpherson of an epic myth, an epic poem related to this kind of archetypal figure of Ossian as a sort of like modern equivalence of Homer. Especially when we talk about pre-Romanticism, we have to mention the poets William Wordsworth, so the lyrical ballads, and especially the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Some of pre-Romanticism owes to the exaltation of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's exaltation of the man of nature. In the German context, pre-Romanticism indicates, again, this sense of wonder and melancholy and nostalgia for the infinite, for the unknown, which also relates to a certain idea of providentialism, of history, and of an education, an exaltation of the spirit of nature that grows over time, kind of the spirit of peoples that grows over time. Some of the names that you might know of from the German area are like Goethe, Schiller, Novalis, and Hölderlin. And the Sturm und Drang movement, so Tempest and Assault, is a movement that really tries to redefine the poetics of what art should look like. In the context of Italy, two are the main figures of the pre-Romantic age. One is Vittorio Alfieri, and the other is beloved poet Ugo Foscolo. Now, the three cities that I wanted to focus on are Milano, Naples, and Venice. This is the map of Milan as it was planned by Napoleon. So you see like a big circle around the site of the Sforza Castle, so the site of the Milan court during the Renaissance. And you see like a circular structure around it as a way to emphasize the site of power. Milano is a Napoleonic city. Part of this circle is realized, the other half is not. And the part that is realized around the castle is called Fort Bonaparte, in honor of Napoleon. And in the end of it, there is also an arc that was meant to replicate the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, that was started during the Napoleonic age and actually was finished in 1838. So it became the Arc of Peace. So it's kind of a monument to restoration, paradoxically. Now, Milano is the site of a reformist enlightenment, which is bound and tied up with Vienna. So with the collaboration with the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Now, three important figures to remember as protagonists of this reformist season of the Enlightenment. One is Pietro Verri, who is the founder of Il Caffè. Il Caffè is the first Italian newspaper. So it's kind of modeled on Edison's Spectator in England. So it was started in 1712. And Il Caffè was a journal of reformist ideas, of enlightened thought, but it was not a journal of theoretical philosophy, but rather a platform for brevi and vari discorsi, so brief and various topics. So practical ideas basically on social issues of any kind. So this is what culture is about, is debating about social modifications and reforms. The second figure is the figure of Cesare Beccaria. He's the author of Dei delitti e delle pene, so of Crimes and Punishments. This book is quite relevant, 1764, because it's the first book that really argues against the death penalty. Again, a reformist thought. And the last figure I want to point your attention to is the figure of Giuseppe Parini, who is kind of the leading poet in Milano during this period. But what is interesting is that his poetry is actually focused on practical issues. So poetry not as a laboratory of aesthetical or avant-garde reflections, but poetry really as a platform for the reflection on social betterment. So we see poems on the quality of air, or poems praising the vaccine against smallpox. So this gives you a sense of the reformist approach of Italian Enlightenment, which is not a protagonist in philosophy, but is a protagonist in the development of practical reforms. This is the same in Naples, where the reformist Enlightenment especially focuses around two figures, Filangieri and Genovesi, who are two figures that are related to the development of legal studies and economic studies on the management of state. So the application of knowledge to the betterment of how a state runs. Now Naples, under Charles of Bourbon, becomes like quite a relevant site in Europe. It was the most populated city in Europe, together with Vienna. It's the site where Charles Bourbon actually builds a palace, a royal palace in the city of Caserta near Naples, which will become the Italian equivalent of Versailles. So Luigi Vanvitelli is the architect of this palace, which is actually shaped like a violin. So the palace is in the middle. You see the gardens that are the body of this violin, and the reflecting pool that is kind of like where the strings end. So the idea of projecting onto space the power of the ruler of the city. This is also the century in Naples where opera buffa develops, and where the traditional sacred music develops in really incredible forms around the figures of Pergolesi, Paisiello, and Scarlatti, who will be greatly influential on the work of Mozart and Beethoven. Now, among them, Giovanni Battista Pergolesi is really the young prodigy of Neapolitan music. He will die very young, but his two works, the Stabat Mater and the opera buffa La Serva Padrona, the servant who becomes kind of the master, that talks about like how Serpina, the servant, becomes the master of her master, Roberto. These two works are really masterpieces and groundbreaking works in music. So the Stabat Mater is in religious music, and La Serva Padrona inaugurates this idea of opera as a funny genre. So opera buffa was kind of placed in between acts of a serious opera, but then it becomes a genre in itself. We'll talk more about this idea of the servant who becomes the master. The last contribution that Naples gives, the last person I want to focus my attention on, is the philosopher Giovan Battista Vico, probably the most important philosopher of the Italian Settecento. Basically, Vico is the philosopher who studies the method. We know about Descartes and his studies on the method to kind of define a method to know scientifically, rationally something. Basically, Vico elaborates a method to create a solid ground to establish the humanities as a science. So a new science, a new method, not just focused on the natural sciences, but on the human sciences. So culture is a new science. So Vico is actually the founder of what we call the humanities. And his method is centered around two kernels. One is the idea of the certum, of what is certain, that is drawn by philology. Philology as the study of what is given to us as a way to appreciate is certain fact, factuality, data. And the second kernel is actually the verum, so the truth, which is granted by philosophical reflection. So philosophy and philology have to work together. A philology that doesn't have the horizon of philosophy becomes very dry and lacks its broader context, whereas philosophy without philology, so ideas without the certainty of the data, become volatile. And the study of language, so the evolution of language, is where Vico detects the intersection of philosophy and philology. So the study of language is really the study of a philosophical philology or philological philosophy. So the genealogy of language, and the genealogy meaning reconstructing the origins and the evolution of knowledge through language, is a way to reconstruct the history of humankind. And this method by Vico is actually explained in length in his philosophical masterpiece, so The Principles of the New Science, whose last edition is published in 1744. The third city is the city of Venice, where we have, protagonists that are quite influential over Europe. Two painters that are really worth remembering are Canaletto and Tiepolo. Canaletto is the painter of the so-called vedute, so views of the city. This is one of them, portraying the geography of the city as a cultural geography, often from the above. And Tiepolo is famous for frescoes all over villas, especially in the context of Venice. This is the triumph of virtue and nobility over ignorance in the mid-17th century. Now, another great name to remember of an intellectual work in Venice is actually Carlo Goldoni. Carlo Goldoni is the author of the so-called theater reform. So this is the Theater La Fenice that was built in Venice in the 1700s for opera. But theater was mostly related not to opera, but to comedy. And the most common comedy was either the classical comedy or even more commonly the commedia dell'arte, so a comedy based on stock characters with fixed roles that act according to slight variations. Now, what Carlo Goldoni introduces is really a bourgeois comedy that actually reflects the daily life of Venetians, and a bourgeois comedy that focuses on the psychological development of characters. Probably the most important and most relevant comedy by Goldoni is La Locandiera, so the innkeeper woman, released in 1753. It's the story of a woman who owns an inn, and a woman who shows her independence in front of three men who want to marry her, and she decides to marry the man who he's in love with, not one of the three marquises or duke that are promising her privileges. So La Locandiera might be related to the same theme of La Serva Padrona, so of the woman that emancipates herself and becomes the master of her destiny. Another great figure in the theatrical life of Venice is actually the figure of Antonio Vivaldi, and you might know, of course, his Four Seasons, but he is also known for sacred music. So his contribution is related to the development of Baroque music into kind of Rococo style. Now, the 18th century is also the century where Italian becomes a universal language, not just because of Italian artists or diplomats, but mainly because of the centrality of Italian to the spreading of the form of opera, which started in the 17th century with Monteverdi and develops throughout Europe around the Italian language, because the Italian language has a lot of vowels, and this gives the advantage of providing singers with a lot of places where they can sing. So Italian is a very suited language for opera. So now this is a statue by Canova. Canova is one of the most important sculptors. He's a universal sculptor that works for many committees in Europe. This is another statue by Canova, the Three Graces, indicating the muses of the arts. And just to give you a sense, this is a statue by Canova of George Washington, which is considered in North Carolina. So the universalism of Italian art through the work of Canova. Speaking of Americans or Italians moving to America, it's important to remember the figure of the diplomat Filippo Mazzei, who organized like a journal, a newspaper in the New World, and who was very influential for Thomas Jefferson. It's been recognized that the phrase "all men are created equal" was taken from by Jefferson from an article by Filippo Mazzei. As we were saying, Italian becomes a universal language, especially in connection to opera and theater. Now, theater in Italy is really a social ritual, and this is confirmed by the creation in the three cities that we mentioned of like three of the most important theaters, not just in Italy, but in the world. So La Fenice in Venice, the San Carlo in Naples, and La Scala in Milan. Italian really becomes the European language of opera because of its malleability and flexibility, and because of its permeability in allowing singers to sing, thanks to the many vowels that Italian has. So Italian librettists are really the most sought after, and the most important librettist of the century is actually Pietro Metastasio, who was the poet court in Vienna for 50 years. He was incredibly famous, and he is the author of several librettos that were used by several musicians. So one of them is the Clemens of Titus, which is a libretto used also by Mozart. But really the most renowned librettist is Lorenzo da Ponte, a slightly less perfect librettist, but way more interesting character. A character that deserves a little bit of expansion here. So basically, he was born in Venice, was born as a Jew. He was converted to Catholicism as a way to receive an education. He was educated in a seminary. He became a priest, but also lived like a very open life. He had a lot of affairs. He was a libertine, and he was actually expelled from the city with charges of concubinage. This expulsion was actually the beginning of his career. He moves to Vienna, where under Emperor Joseph II, he actually starts his collaboration with Mozart. Three of Mozart's most famous operas are based on librettos written by Da Ponte, so Le Nozze di Figaro, The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte, so Women Are Like That. At the death of Mozart, he actually goes into financial and political ruin. So with the new emperor, he falls in disgrace and is forced to leave for London. And in London, he writes certain librettos, but he mainly lives like a dissolute life and goes into financial ruin that forces him to actually escape to the United States. At the end of the 19th century, it was really an escape more than kind of an immigration, as we saw, as we'll see later with the Great Immigration. So in the United States, he arrives in 1805, works at the bakery in New York City. He becomes an Italian tutor in the city of Sunbury in Pennsylvania, north of Philadelphia. He's involved in a trial in the city of Philadelphia and escapes to New York to avoid this trial. And in New York, out of a series of incredible circumstances that are narrated in his memoir, his life is really something worth reading, he will find the first Italian department in the United States at Columbia University. So he is the father of Italian studies in the U.S. Now, The Marriage of Figaro, the first opera, is both a serious and a comic opera. So he combines the tradition of serious opera with the tradition of opera buffa, or comic opera. And he stages through the opera the reverting of roles. So the master and the servant, so the idea of the serva padrona in Pergolesi or the locandiera in Goldoni. And basically stages the outwitting of aristocracy. So basically, a woman who was supposed to go to be married to a count, Susanna, that actually manages to outwit the counts use prime noctis on her and marry her husband Figaro. So this is actually a quite revolutionary theme that is a forerunner, considered a forerunner of the French Revolution 3 years later. His real opera, his most famous opera, is Don Giovanni, and Don Giovanni, like Women Are Like That, is a sort of a school of love, but it's a way, way deeper reflection on the century. So we conclude our presentation with Don Giovanni as an icon, a cultural hero that synthesizes the whole century in its complexity. So Don Giovanni has antecedents in European culture. In Spain, in Spanish culture, so the idea of the burlador de Sevilla, so the deceiver of Seville, and in Molière, in French poetry, so the festin de pierre, so the invited, the person who is invited to a banquet made of stone. It's based on the final scene of a man that Don Giovanni kills that emerges from his tomb, so he's a man of stone, that actually invites Don Giovanni to have dinner with him and drags him down into hell. Now, the figure of Don Giovanni is the figure of a seducer, so this is like presented in a comic tone, but also the figure of someone who is a punished seducer. So this is also a serious opera that contains a serious reflection on men's destiny and men's relationship with death and judgment. So Don Giovanni is really an archetype of many things. He's the archetype of the seducer, the deceiver, the atheist soul that doesn't have any respect for all the women he wins over. And he keeps a catalog of them. He's cruel, he's sacrilegious. He goes into a cemetery and actually challenges to like a person that he killed in a duel to accept his invitation for dinner. He's also very comic, especially in connection with his servant Leporello. He's really the prince of disguise. He basically wins a lot of women over by his disguising, and is comic but demonic at the same time, and is lascivious. At the end of the opera, he is confronted with his destiny, is confronted with his sins, and he is asked to repent 3 times. And the opera concludes with Don Giovanni, who lives this dissolute life, libertine life, if we want, in the same way as Da Ponte's life was, more than Mozart's. And basically, in front of the request to repent, he replies 3 times no, and is punished in hell. So Don Giovanni is really a figure that synthesizes a very complex century, like rational reason, but also a sense of religiosity that is still in dialogue with kind of the presence of the church, or with the religion, if we want. And is certainly one of the figures that deserves more attention in scholarly studies.